The reading is by Margaret Fuller, who is a Unitarian author and educator, a transcendentalist organizer, and a close associate of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Elizabeth Peabody, and William Ellery Channing. Margaret Fuller died in 1850. This is an excerpt from what I think of as her manifesto, punnily entitled, A New Manifestation. She writes, "A new manifestation is at hand. A new hour is come, when man and woman may regard each other as brother and sister, able both to appreciate and to prophesy to one another. What woman needs is not as woman to act or rule, but as a nature to grow, as an intelligence to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded, to unfold such powers as were given to her. Man does not have his fair share either. His energies are repressed and distorted by artificial obstacles. A new manifestation is at hand. A new hour is come. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. Were this done, we believe a divine energy would pervade nature to a degree unknown in former ages. A new manifestation is at hand. A new hour is come." With that, a very happy Mother's Day to all the mothers here and at home this morning. So many types of mothers, as Jamie pointed out. For this celebration of motherhood and womanhood, I'd like to tell you the story of 21 brave pastors of Universalist congregations in the American Midwest between 1880 and 1930. 21 pastors in the American Midwest who happened to be women. The story starts about 1870 with Mary Safford and Eleanor Gordon, who were in their early 20s. In that year, they sat together, Safford and Gordon, on a bluff over the Missouri River and pledged to each other that they would spend their lives serving Unitarianism as a team, the two of them. Safford and Gordon could not go to seminary because of their gender, so they designed their own program of self-education. They focused on Emerson and Whittier and Theodore Parker and read all the classics. Within 5 years, the two women started a Unitarian church in their hometown, and soon they were preaching to a small but stable congregation every week. And there they began to mentor young women for the ministry. The school and the church that they were promoted to by the secretary of the Western Conference. The secretary of the Western Conference was a male ally named Lloyd Jenkins. Lloyd Jenkins, I forget his first name. And I didn't plan to mention him, but he was an ally and he was vital to their growth. He promoted them to a larger town where there was an established church and school, and they continued their work there. That became a hub for a pastoral network for Unitarian women who felt called to the ministry. And that network spread through Iowa and into neighboring states. And as women were installed in congregations that had previously struggled, those congregations began to thrive. By the 1890s, nearly every liberal pulpit in the Midwest, which extended from Ohio to Iowa and eastern Nebraska, and from northern Missouri all the way to northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, nearly every liberal pulpit in that Midwestern Conference had at some point had a woman conducting its services within 20 years of their pledge. The sisters, the Prophetic Sisters, as the group came to be called, not only grew the membership of their churches and revitalized churches that had been struggling in small towns, they also developed local financial support and made those churches independent of the patriarchal Unitarian Association that was centered in New England, who really didn't like that much what was going on. Why were these women pastors in the Midwest able to grow and stabilize their congregations while many men who came there from the East floundered and left? First, the women pastors tended their congregations as families rather than as churches to be managed. They tended them as families, not as small business to be run. Secondly, nearly all of them were former school teachers, so they tended to view themselves as teachers and not as lecturers. Their sermons were not built up with fancy words and intellectual prowess to try to wow people, which was one of the same complaints that Martin Luther had about the Catholic priests before the Reformation, if you think about it. They taught, they didn't lecture. And finally, the women designed their church buildings, and think about your church home here. It's still the same if you're at home. Imagine what it's like here. Think about what it's like. They replaced high pulpits and fancy cathedrals with low platforms and simple halls like we are in today. They used unreserved chairs, upholstered chairs like you have here that can be moved around instead of pews that had family names on them that had been paid for. They installed fireplaces and friendly furnishings, large kitchens like we have back here, and open multi-use spaces. I take it that this is an open multi-use space that you can do a lot of things in this room. It's designed that way. And that's where that began, where that came from. The informal atmosphere aligned with that relaxed Western culture, just as it does here in Gettysburg, as compared to a more formal life back east. You will see a very different Unitarian congregation if you go to certain churches in our big cities in Maryland. And that's not to say that that's bad, that's a thing. And this is a thing too. The informal atmosphere also matched Unitarian theology better than traditional church architecture did. The traditional church architecture evoked Trinitarianism long after the crucifixes were removed, right? But most things that go up eventually come down. The pendulum began to swing the other way, and that is what happened to the Prophetic Sisterhood. It was as early as 1883 that the Western women who excelled in leadership at that regional level began to run into a glass ceiling as they approached the national level. It took 20 years to get one woman onto the board of directors of the American Unitarian Association, and she was the last woman until the 1950s. The authoritarian president of the AUA, the American Unitarian Association, Samuel Eliot, not Sam Elliott, different Sam Elliott, but there seemed to be some similarities in the character between Samuel Eliot and the characters that Samuel Eliot often plays. Samuel Eliot was the father of T.S. Eliot, and he refused to recommend women for contracts with churches for settled ministry. He pushed women back into traditional roles in religious education and childcare and social work. It was under his direction that the national office refused to send out literature unless it was ordered by a man. How passive aggressive can you get? He ignored requests for appearances by him and his staff at Western Conference meetings and church dedications. Where's the unity in that? The Eastern Patriarchy demanded literal biblical interpretations of gender-specific natures and roles, although even Unitarians of the day were not that literal about other things. And it talked about how women's keen intuitive powers compensated for their alleged intellectual weaknesses, and this appeared in print. So as the women began to leave the ministry, as less effective Harvard men began to fill the pulpits, Harvard was still a Unitarian university at the time. 6 of the 12 congregations established by the Prophetic Sisterhood had dwindled away and died by 1910. And many of those established women ministers retooled their ministries in other areas like the women's suffrage movement, the anti-war movement, and the settlement movement, which foreshadowed the modern social worker and the direct care industry. The first decade of the 1900s was really the beginning of a long dry spell for women in the UU ministry. It was not until 7 decades later that the UU General Assembly passed the Women and Religion Resolution. That resolution set goals to put traditional assumptions and language about gender in perspective and to avoid sexist assumption and language. Since that resolution, women in the UU ministry have increased from 5% in 1978 to over 50% today. Yay. One lesson that I draw from this is that we must continue in watchfulness and awareness. We have a critical mass at 50%, I would say, right? But we need to continue to be watchful and wary to maintain that balance in our time, to safeguard ourselves against misogyny as we safeguard ourselves against racism in our congregations and in our association. And besides, much remains to be done for gender equality in society as a whole, as we're all painfully aware of in watching the news this week. We may think of this as a bittersweet story about courageous women who knew themselves and stood their ground, but I'd like to do a little pivot here. There's more to it, I think, than that. Think back to Chuang Tzu, who in our reflection told us that dichotomy and dualism are illusions. For Chuang Tzu, reality is one big interconnected web of existence, not a bunch of discrete stories about individuals in opposition, like the story we have just heard. We can make heroes of the women of the Prophetic Sisterhood, and I do. We can also villainize the Boston patriarchy. And since Sam Elliott is such a convenient character, and I don't really like him or his son that much, I villainize them too. But Chuang Tzu's reality is what Ken Wilber describes in his book, No Boundaries, that is so real today. Wilber writes this, and see if this resonates with your life today. He says, in blindly pursuing progress, our civilization has institutionalized frustration. We try to maximize the positive and eliminate the negative. We forget entirely that the positive and the negative define each other. The opposites might indeed be as different as night and day. But the essential point is that without night, we would not even be able to recognize something called day. In other words, night and day is a false dualism. They depend on each other. Or womanhood and manhood is a false dualism. In reality, gender is a spectrum, not a case of either or, but where are you on the continuum? This evokes for me Margaret Fuller, again from our reading, where she wrote that man and woman may regard one another as brother and sister, that every arbitrary barrier be thrown down, that a divine energy would pervade nature. So the broader truth for me of the story of the prophetic sisterhood is that these were all real people who both triumphed and failed. All of them had their moments of human dignity and human foibles. There's lots to the story that I didn't tell you this morning. Safford and Gifford, for example, didn't remain friends their whole lives. Many women of the prophetic sisterhood came into conflict with their male allies in the Western Conference. Jenkins Lloyd Jones, that was his name, Jenkins Lloyd Jones, if you want to look him up on the internet. He moved on past liberal Christianity and fell out of touch and into conflict with many of his former woman proteges. Some of the women became disillusioned and gave up the women in the ministry entirely. And even Sam Eliot, poor Samuel Eliot, judged himself a failure in the raising of his son, T.S. Eliot, who, as a fallen Unitarian, joined the most conservative branch of Protestantism that there is. Likewise, all of us today, when we choose to lose our self-awareness in either the positive or the negative, when we choose to lose ourselves in either one or the other, and lose our view of the whole, that's when we swing back and forth wildly between the two false poles of dualism. If we don't maintain the practice of staying in the whole, we will begin to vacillate and experience Wilber's institutionalized frustration. For example, there are a lot of good things and a lot of bad things about living in America, and we can look at two lists. I've selected a few of those good things about living in America from an article where immigrants were asked what surprised them most about living in the United States. Who better to ask than someone who hasn't lived here their whole life about what hits them on the head when they come to this country. They say things like free public restrooms, the good things about America. Clean streets. One person wrote, try finding a trash can on the street in Pakistan. Trash cans on city sidewalks. The fact that no one was threatening to kill their family based on religious beliefs. The awareness of people here to fight for their rights. Either side, at least we're fighting for our rights as we see them. Not having to take extra money for a bribe when you go to get your driver's license. Never thought about that. The social safety net that exists here. One person wrote, I lived in poverty when I came here, but I never went hungry. And one person wrote, fireflies. I honestly thought they were mythical like fairies until I saw one for the first time in Virginia. But on the flip side, there are negatives about our lives here in America that we're all well aware of. Women's rights and civil rights are under assault. The world keeps getting hotter. Small d democratic institutions are openly threatened and attacked. And the nuclear peril once again takes front and center in our minds. When we focus on one artificial pole and then the other, swinging back and forth with our consciousness, never sitting with the whole story in meditation all at once. When we do that, that is when we fool ourselves into thinking that we have crystal clear thinking. And with our negative bias that's evolutionarily based, we tend to focus on the negative. That is when we experience Wilber's institutionalized frustration. That is when we push to maximize our positives, to minimize our negatives, and operate out of fear. And we end up defining ourselves by the boundaries that we create around us. And that isolates us from others, traps us in prisons, in echo chambers of our own making. If we define other people as all bad and totally evil, or all good and totally great, it cuts us off from all possibility of conversation and future understanding. And I'm not saying that other people are never jerks. Sometimes they are. Sometimes I am. The point, though, is not to save them. The point of our meditation, of our quiet times, is to save ourselves. By meditating on the way things are, the Tao, as an integrated, interconnected whole, we will maintain and improve our own emotional and mental health. And by breaking down our own self-imposed walls, we free ourselves from prisons of fear and of our own making. So if there's one thing that I hope you'll take from this message, it's that us and them, good and bad, right and wrong, female and male, black and white, are all artificial constructs anyway. They are valuable distinctions that are worth recognizing in the world. As distinctions, they add diversity and richness and timing to our relationships, and they allow each of us to be who we are, to express ourselves as ourselves out of our own experience. But when we turn dichotomies and dualism into judgments, into contests of good versus evil, of us versus them, that is when we run into trouble. The most trying situations, existential ones like the Prophetic Sisterhood found itself in, these are really the greatest opportunities for personal growth and for community growth. So in our personal quiet times, as we meditate and plan our days, let us lay the mental groundwork to mend fences with our neighbors who may not think exactly like we do. It is there in our quiet times that we choose between spiritual despair and spiritual wholeness. The old habit dies hard. Aristotle's everywhere. There's another dichotomy, right? Spiritual despair and spiritual wholeness. I'll mull on that one for a while. But let us always remember that we do have choices. And let us choose the path of spiritual wholeness, whatever that is.